Oi pessoal, tudo bem? Hoje we're going to talk about zoom lenses versus prime lenses and which one might be best for you. So one of the most asked questions on this channel, aside from what camera should I buy, is what lens should I go with? And if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you'll know that I always emphasize spending more money on your lens than on the camera body itself, because I think that lenses can kind of play more into how your final image is going to look more so than just the sensor behind them. So in today's video, I'm going to be covering the zoom and prime lens that I like the most. And because I live in the micro four thirds world, I am going to be talking about micro four thirds lenses, but this can kind of be translated to basically any camera system that you shoot with. The two lenses that I'm going to be talking about, my trusty DJI 15mm f1.7 and my Olympus 12-40 f2.8 Pro. And these are two lenses that I use all the time. And often when I go out on a shoot, I'm usually deciding between shooting on my little 15mm or on my zoom. So let's go over some pros and cons between prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses are typically pretty fast, meaning they have larger apertures than zoom lenses. And also they're very small, so they don't make your camera rig super big and bulky. And depending on what prime lens you go with, they can be a lot cheaper than zoom lenses. But the pros for zoom is that you have a lot more versatility. So you can choose between a bunch of different focal lengths. And that makes them a lot better for run and gun style shooting or documentaries. They also tend to look a bit cooler on your camera rig as well. One thing that I should point out about zooms is that there are really cheap zooms that you'll get for your camera system, whether it's micro four thirds, APS-C, or full frame, that have what's called a variable aperture. So at the wide end, it'll typically be a larger aperture, and at the long end, it'll have to close down to a smaller aperture. And that's not really ideal, especially if you are going to be shooting with a lot of different focal lengths at a time. That means you're going to lose light as you zoom in. So if you're going to be going for a zoom lens, I would definitely recommend looking into a zoom lens that has a constant aperture. Like this Olympus 12-40 has a constant aperture of f2.8. But something else that I would encourage you to look into, depending on what prime or zoom lens you go with, is let's say you decided on the Olympus 12-40. Well, you can actually go to a website called DxOMark, and they test a lot of different cameras and lenses, and you can actually see what the t-stop of that lens is. The t-stop of this Olympus 12-40, I believe, is T3.3. So that gives you a little bit better of an idea of like how much light is actually going to be coming through the lens. So the majority of my YouTube career has been filmed on this little DJI 15mm f1.7. I think that if you're in the micro four thirds world, this is a must-have lens if you're looking for a nice prime lens that you can make YouTube videos with, because this gives you about a 30mm equivalent field of view, and that's a really nice field of view for doing talking head shots. And with the 1.7 aperture, it really helps blow out the background a bit. But that's not to say that you can't film YouTube videos with a zoom lens as well. Right now I'm using the 12-40 and I have it at 14mm. This gives a really nice 28mm full frame equivalent field of view, and I think that this works really well for YouTube videos. And even though f2.8 isn't super fast, you can see that I'm still getting some separation in the background of my shot. And I think that as long as you have a nice light to light you up with, f2.8 totally works on micro four thirds sensors. It's not going to look the same as a lot of your favorite YouTubers who use full frame cameras, but I still think that it gives a really pleasing look. So before we go into the cons of primes and zooms, I do want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creative and curious people. Whether it's photography, video, design, Skillshare has thousands of inspiring classes that'll help you gain more knowledge on whatever subject you're interested in. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, so you'll never have to deal with any annoying ads. A Skillshare class I took recently and can't recommend enough is Storytelling in Film, Using Cinematography to Convey Emotion by the legendary Joe Simon. Joe takes you through how he approaches lighting, camera movement, framing, and composition, and you'll learn a lot as he shares some great advice for any aspiring cinematographer. I've always been a fan of Joe's work, and after watching this class, it really makes me want to go out and practice my lighting and composition. The really cool thing is that the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so definitely don't sleep on that. Click the link in the description below and get that 1-month free trial. Once again, big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Okay, so now let's talk about the cons of prime lenses and zoom lenses. So with primes, I think the biggest con is that even if you get a full set of primes, like a wide, a mid, and a telephoto, you're still gonna have to be switching those out constantly whenever you want to change focal lengths. And that can kind of be not only annoying, but it can also introduce dust and particles to get into your camera sensor when you're changing them out. I recently did a project with my friend Jackie, and we were filming a woodworking project, and there was sawdust and particles all over the air. And so when I was shooting that, I shot most of it on my Olympus 12-40 because I didn't want to have to be switching out my lenses all the time and risk getting a bunch of sawdust inside of my camera. Even though I do think that this 15mm is a very versatile focal length, sometimes if I want a really tight shot, getting in really close just doesn't give me the same perspective that I want as maybe putting on a 45mm or something like that. And another con, which doesn't really mean anything to me, but sometimes, especially in the Micro Four Thirds world, when you're using super small prime lenses like this, they just don't look that professional on your rig. You look a lot more official when you have a nice big zoom lens on it. That's really stupid, I know, but it is one thing that you might have to consider. So some of the cons with zoom lenses is that they're typically not as fast as prime lenses, save for the Sigma 18-35. But typically when you're getting a zoom lens, especially a native zoom lens for your camera, they typically live at around the 2.8 range. So when shooting in low light, that isn't ideal. But again, as long as you think about your lighting and you know how to use your camera properly with the right ISO, that isn't the biggest deal. And another con, I think, is that you get a little bit lazy sometimes when you're using a zoom lens. Instead of changing your perspective by moving the camera, you tend to just zoom in and zoom out whenever you want to change your frame. And I'm definitely guilty of this as well. Sometimes when I shoot with this 12-40, I'll be so indecisive with my focal length that I'll be zooming in and out during my shot. And sometimes it ruins shots that would have looked good if I just kept it at one focal length and wasn't fidgeting with my framing so much. So I think that's one of the biggest cons with zoom lenses, is that you get a little bit too lazy with your framing. But I think overall, for most people, especially YouTubers, I think that having a zoom lens is almost a little bit more practical. And the biggest reason is because you can do talking head stuff like this, but then you can also zoom in and do some product B-roll and stuff like that. Whereas with prime lenses, you would have to use one lens for a talking head and then another one for doing product B-roll or doing some super wide stuff. So having a zoom lens, I think, is just a lot more of a practical solution for content creators. But again, that's not to say that I don't like prime lenses. This is my favorite lens and I've had it for years, and I'll probably keep it for as long as I have a Micro Four Thirds camera. And I think that if you're in the APS-C world, getting something like the new Sigma 18-55 f2.8 for your Sony camera is a great option. Or in the full frame world, get whatever 24-70 f2.8 is made for your camera system, and then just a good solid prime lens that you can really blow out the background with. So something like a 35mm or a 50mm. I think that that combo of having a good zoom and a really nice prime, you can accomplish almost anything you want to having those two options. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to share my thoughts on prime lenses versus zoom lenses. I hope that you found this video helpful, if not entertaining. If you did, hit the like button. And if you want to see some more of my videos, you can click right there. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll catch y'all next time. Later.